Amidst the heart of a bustling modern city, where towering glass skyscrapers seemed to pierce the gray sky of a chilly winter day, Anne Hathaway emerged gracefully from the sleek revolving doors of a luxurious hotel. The faint morning light of winter reflected off the glass facades, painting a stark contrast between the serene heavens above and the chaotic rhythm of life below. The air resonated with the distant blare of car horns, the hurried footsteps of passers-by, and the steady hum of machinery echoing from construction sites nearby. In the midst of the bustling crowd, Anne appeared as a radiant figure in motion, her black sunglasses adding an enigmatic allure to her stylish presence. Each step she took exuded confidence and poise, as if her every movement declared her distinct individuality. Yet behind the sharpness of her gaze lingered a trace of weariness, subtle remnants of a long, demanding day, adding to her unique charm that seemed both unapproachable and deeply compelling. At the curbside, a sleek black limousine awaited her, and beside it stood James, a distinguished chauffeur in his 60s. His posture was impeccable as he respectfully opened the car door, greeting her with a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Hathaway," he said, his voice steady and professional. "I hope you had a wonderful stay." Anne offered a faint smile, her eyes betraying a hint of fatigue. "Thank you, James. Everything was fine. I just want to go home now. But before that, we need to stop for a quick photo shoot." As she prepared to step into the plush vehicle, a sudden blur of motion caught her attention. A small figure darted past her, startling her momentarily. A young boy, his hair cropped short and dressed in worn clothes, clung tightly to her leg. His wide, fear-stricken eyes stared off into the distance, refusing to meet hers. Startled but composed, Anne crouched down, gently placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. Before he could respond, an angry shout sliced through the air. "That kid!" A man in his 40s, his face flushed and wearing an apron with a convenience store logo, stormed toward them. His eyes locked onto the boy, oblivious to Anne's identity. "That kid's always hanging around my store, scaring customers and bringing bad luck. I told him to stay away." Anne raised an eyebrow, her worry deepening. The tension in the air was palpable as curiosity about the boy's plight flickered in her mind. "Has he done something wrong?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with subtle defiance. The man, visibly seething, spat out his grievances. "No, he didn't steal anything, but he's always lurking, touching things without buying, making my regulars uncomfortable. I'm sure he's up to something." Anne nodded thoughtfully, her gaze steady. "Perhaps you shouldn't judge someone solely by their actions. There may be reasons you can't see," she said gently, her words carrying a philosophical undertone. "This boy's story might be more complex than it seems." It was only then that the man realized who she was. His face turned crimson as he stammered out an apology. "Oh, I'm so sorry. You're Anne Hathaway. I didn't recognize you." Anne waved off his apology with a composed gesture. "It's all right. No need to worry," she said evenly, her voice calm yet firm. "But let me ask, has this boy ever actually damaged anything in your store?" The man sighed, his gaze drifting back to where the boy had clung to her leg. "No, nothing damaged. He's just a nuisance, always wandering around, never buying anything." He muttered under his breath, realizing he was still speaking to someone of her stature. Anne smiled faintly and turned back toward the limousine. "Sometimes things aren't always as they seem," she remarked. James closed the car door behind her, and for a brief moment, an eerie silence enveloped them, broken only by the distant hum of the city. As the limousine began to move, Anne reclined in her seat, her thoughts lingering on the boy's haunted expression. The frosty morning outside seemed to mirror her reflective mood. Streams of light from the bustling traffic danced on the car's window, but within Anne's mind the encounter replayed like a shard of memory cutting into her soul. "James," she called out suddenly, her voice tinged with urgency. "Could you drive a little slower? I want to take a look around." "Certainly, Mizzy." "Hathaway," James replied, adjusting the car's speed to a gentle crawl. Anne's sharp eyes scanned the city streets through the tinted window, searching for the boy's small figure amidst the crowd. As her gaze flitted over countless unfamiliar faces, a sense of unease grew within her. "I don't know," she murmured, her brows furrowing. "That boy. He seemed so frightened. I think his name might be Tom. 9 or 10 years old. I have to find him." "Of course, ma'am," James responded with his characteristic calm. Would she find the boy again? If you think Anne will reunite with Tom, hit the like button and stay tuned. The story isn't over yet. The city continued its relentless pace, with pedestrians hurrying past, street vendors setting up their carts, and tourists immersing themselves in the urban marvels. Anne's search remained fruitless as her eyes combed the sea of strangers, hoping for a glimpse of the boy. Just as she was about to give up, her gaze caught sight of a small figure slumped against the wall outside the convenience store. "James!" Anne exclaimed urgently. "Stop here!" The limousine came to a smooth halt, and Anne stepped onto the sidewalk. There he was, the boy, seated on the ground, a paper cup extended before him. He looked utterly exhausted, his eyes filled with despair. But when he noticed Anne, his face lit up with astonishment. "Hello, Tom," Anne said gently, crouching down to his level. She reached into her wallet and placed several large bills into the cup. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment silence hung between them before he flung his arms around her leg, holding on tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. Anne's smile softened. "It's all right, Tom. You'll be okay." The boy's gaze met hers, shimmering with newfound hope. "Are you Anne Hathaway, the pretty lady from the movies?" Anne laughed softly. "Yes, that's me. But tell me, Tom, why are you here all alone like this?" The boy glanced around anxiously, then whispered, "Miss, please help me. I need—" But before he could finish, a crowd suddenly gathered around them. Fans who had recognized Anne, raising their phones to take pictures. The boy, frightened, shrank back, cowering under the overwhelming attention. Anne gently stepped back, composed, and made her way toward the waiting limousine. Yet her mind lingered on the image of the distressed boy. The calm afternoon air was abruptly broken by the firm steps of James, guiding Anne Hathaway through the bustling crowd. His commanding yet polite voice cut through the chaos as he signaled for people to clear the path. His hands rested lightly on Anne's shoulders, a steadying gesture that guided her into the sleek limousine parked by the curb. As she settled inside, Anne glanced back, her gaze heavy with worry, searching the crowd that was now swallowing the boy she had just encountered. "Thank you, but we should stick to the schedule," James said, his tone resolute yet respectful. Anne leaned slightly forward, her lips moving faintly. "Did you hear me, James?" Her voice carried a wistful sadness, unlike her usual confident tone. "Yes, I heard you," Anne replied, her voice unexpectedly somber, her eyes fixated on the distant skyline, as if searching for an answer she hadn't yet found. Her whispered promise, "I'll come back," lingered in the air like a sigh, a fleeting vow left behind for the boy amidst the bustling streets. James seized the moment of silence, signaling the driver to proceed. The limousine glided through the city streets, but Anne couldn't shake the haunting images in her mind. She couldn't forget the boy's pleading face, etched with helplessness, a pain that tugged at her heart. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her reverie. It was a call from the event organizer confirming the time and location for her upcoming photo shoot. Anne forced a faint smile, reassuring them she was en route. Yet in her thoughts, the boy's shadow lingered. "Do we still have a few minutes, James?" Anne asked, gazing out the window. Approximately 5 minutes, ma'am, James replied without further inquiry. After a brief pause, Anne turned to him, her eyes glinting with resolve. Turn back now. I need to take care of something. The car began to slow as Anne issued her directive. Her gaze scanned the streets, searching for any trace of the boy, but as they neared the spot where she had last seen him, her heart sank. The crowd had dispersed, and there was no sign of him. I'll be back shortly, Anne told James as the limousine stopped near a convenience store. She stepped out, her movements quiet yet purposeful. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a stark glow, amplifying the eerie stillness. Shelves lined with lifeless goods stretched endlessly, their presence cold and indifferent. Anne walked the aisles silently, her eyes sweeping over every corner hoping for a clue, but there was nothing. Only silence. At the counter, she mustered the courage to ask, I'm looking for a boy, bald, about this tall. She gestured with her hand. The cashier barely glanced up, then resumed their disinterest. No answers? No concern. Anne sighed, the weight of frustration pressing against her chest, but she refused to give up. Thank you, she murmured softly before stepping back outside to continue her search. A gentle breeze seemed to pass through her soul as she returned to the limousine. She clutched her phone, scrolling through her packed schedule, but her mind remained consumed by the boy. Time was slipping away and she felt the urgency growing. The limousine began to move again, but Anne's unease was palpable. Then a soft knock on the window shattered the stillness. Startled, she turned. And there, as if fate had intervened, she saw the boy. His small hands pressed against the glass, his wide eyes peering inside. Anne's heart leapt in a moment of disbelief. It was him. There was no mistake. As the traffic light turned red, Anne didn't hesitate. She opened the door and pulled the boy inside just as the light switched to green. The door closed with a faint thud, and the boy, so small and fragile, seemed almost out of place within the opulent interior of the limousine. For the first time, he appeared to breathe a sigh of relief, though Anne's gaze remained laced with concern. What's your name? Anne asked gently, her tone soothing as she tried to make him feel safe. Tom, he replied softly, his eyes avoiding hers, fixed instead on the world outside the window. Anne smiled faintly. Tom, can you tell me what's wrong? The boy said nothing but pointed toward an old, run-down building. Tom, what do you need help with? Anne asked, noticing a large bruise on his arm. In that brief exchange, all of Anne's questions were answered. The boy was ill and desperately needed money for medicine. Anne felt the depth of his despair in every word he struggled to speak. I'll help you, Anne promised, immediately instructing James to drive to the nearest orphanage. She wouldn't let the boy endure another moment of pain. But as they approached, Anne noticed Tom growing weaker. His steps faltered, and a wave of worry washed over her. When the limousine came to a halt, Anne helped the boy out, but in an unfortunate moment, he stumbled and collapsed. Anne rushed to his side, cradling his head in her hands, her voice trembling with reassurance. The warm trickle of blood from a cut on his forehead made her heart ache. Don't worry, you'll be fine, Anne said, her voice shaking. She quickly called for an ambulance, and its sirens soon pierced the stillness. The boy's soft voice broke through the surrounding noise, calling her name faintly. Miss Anne. His trembling hand grasped hers. Will you stay with me? Anne's heart tightened as she felt the worry in every word the little boy spoke. She turned to look at Johnson, who nodded encouragingly. Of course, Tom, she replied, gently squeezing the boy's hand. I'll be right here with you. But as the medical team prepared to load Tom into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Anne with a regretful expression. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can only allow one person to ride along. The boy's guardian will have to accompany him. Anne nodded, understanding the situation. She crouched down to meet Tom's gaze and spoke softly. "Listen, sweetheart. Johnson will ride with you in the ambulance, but I promise I'll meet you at the hospital." Tom's lips quivered, but he nodded bravely. "You promise?" he whispered. Anne responded with a reassuring wink, earning a faint smile from the boy. As the paramedics lifted Tom into the ambulance, Johnson climbed in beside him. The doors shut, and the vehicle sped off, sirens wailing, leaving only the fading red and blue lights against the night. Anne turned to James, who stood silently waiting. "We'll follow them to the hospital," she said firmly. "Can you keep up with the ambulance?" James nodded and headed toward the limousine. "Absolutely, Mrs. Hathaway. I'll make sure we stay on their tail." The two set off through the bustling traffic, Anne sitting quietly in the back seat, her mind racing with questions about Tom's condition and the life he'd led at the orphanage. James navigated skillfully, maintaining a respectful distance from the ambulance to ensure they didn't lose sight of it. The cityscape blurred into a haze of buildings and fleeting faces, but Anne's focus stayed firmly on the ambulance ahead, carrying the boy who had just stepped into her life. At the hospital, the air was thick with activity, the scent of antiseptics mingling with the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Anne approached the nurse's station and inquired about Tom. "The boy is being examined by the doctor," a nurse informed her, pointing toward a curtained area. "Are you family?" Anne hesitated briefly before replying, "I'm a friend of his." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "You can wait outside the curtain. The doctor will update you shortly." Seated on an uncomfortable plastic chair outside Tom's room, Anne spotted Johnson nearby. Their eyes met, and a wave of relief washed over her face. The silence between them was heavy until Johnson suddenly stopped, his eyes widening in realization. "Oh my," he stammered, his voice trembling. "You're Anne Hathaway? I'm so sorry, I didn't realize. How are you connected to all of this?" Anne gave a brief account of her encounters with Tom, from the moment she found him outside the hotel to their crossing paths at the traffic light. Johnson listened intently, his expression a mix of gratitude and astonishment. "Anne, I'm so glad you're here," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I feel I owe you an explanation about Tom's situation." Anne nodded, urging him to continue. Johnson took a deep breath before saying, "Our orphanage has been struggling financially for years. We've done our best to care for the children, but when Tom was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, we found ourselves unable to continue. We just couldn't afford his treatment." Anne felt her chest tighten at the stark reality of his words. Tom's behavior, his presence in the shops, his desperation, all suddenly made sense. "Perhaps that's why he was in those stores," she murmured. Johnson nodded, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Yes, and keeping him at the orphanage has become increasingly difficult. We simply can't give him what he needs." Just then, Anne's phone rang. "Excuse me, I need to take this," she said quickly, stepping outside to answer a call from an event organizer who sounded frantic. "Where are you? We've been waiting for over an hour. The photo shoot is delayed." Anne paced, trying to find a quiet spot to respond. "I won't make it," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There's an emergency. I'll accept whatever consequences come from breaching the contract, but I need to be here." Ending the call, Anne knew the repercussions could be severe. But as she returned to the curtained area where Tom was, she felt confident she had made the right decision. Johnson wiped his eyes, looking at Anne with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough," he said, "but I have to ask, what happens now?" Anne met his gaze with resolve. "We need to ensure Tom gets the treatment he needs. While we wait for the doctor, tell me more about your orphanage, Johnson." Johnson took a deep breath, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "The orphanage is called Little Stars," he began softly. "We've been running it for over 20 years, but it's become increasingly difficult. We don't have the funds to sustain it anymore, and it's crushing our hopes." Anne listened intently, her heart aching. She knew she had to help and vowed to do whatever it took. "Don't worry," Anne said, her voice gentle yet resolute. "We'll change that. We'll make sure he's taken care of." Anne was determined. Tom wouldn't have to face this battle alone anymore. Before heading back into the hospital, Anne turned to James, who stood patiently beside the limousine. He met her gaze with quiet understanding, sensing her concern. "I think I'll stay here overnight," Anne said softly, her voice lowering. "Why don't you take this car back? Bring mine tomorrow. We don't need to draw too much attention." James nodded, fully understanding her intention. "Of course, Anne. Do you need me to bring anything tomorrow morning?" he asked, his tone filled with a concern that offered an invisible comfort. Anne thought for a moment. "A change of clothes would be great, and maybe some books or children's games." She smiled faintly, trying to appear calm, but a heavy feeling lingered within her. "I have a feeling we might need them." James nodded again and left, leaving Anne to step into the hospital, where the oppressive atmosphere seemed to stifle her. As she entered the hospital lobby, Anne's attention was drawn to a nearby DVD vending machine. Her eyes lit up when she noticed Pirates of the Caribbean among the available titles. A fleeting smile crossed her weary face as she purchased the movie, hoping it might lift Tom's spirits, a boy she had always considered family. She turned back toward the emergency ward hallway, only to find the silence unnerving. The faint sound of nurses' footsteps and the hum of machinery echoed through the space. A wave of unease crept into her chest. At the nurses' station, Anne paused briefly, her eyes brightening as she recognized one of the nurses. "Where have they moved Tom?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. The nurse glanced up from her paperwork and offered a polite smile. "Oh, Anne, he's been moved to room 207. Mr. Johnson is there. You can go right up." A temporary sense of relief washed over Anne as she quickly made her way down the hallway, determined to do everything she could to help Tom. Nearing room 207, she saw Mr. Johnson talking with a doctor. Anne stopped to listen, the hollow hospital walls weighing heavily on her mind. "We need to perform surgery immediately to remove the main tumor and affected lymph nodes," the doctor said gravely, his eyes fixed on the medical files. "Afterward, we'll have a treatment plan, possibly chemotherapy or radiation, depending on his response." Mr. Johnson's face darkened. His voice trembled as he asked, "Will the boy be okay?" The doctor looked at him reassuringly. "He's stable following the preliminary tests. We've treated his injuries, and the CT scan shows no brain trauma despite the severe impact. I believe he'll handle the surgery well. Of course, there are risks, but we'll do everything we can." Anne felt her heart clench. She stepped forward, interrupting the doctor. "Dr. Cruz," she said firmly, her eyes gleaming with determination, "I want Tom to receive the best care possible, no matter the cost. Can you make that happen?" Dr. Cruz looked momentarily surprised to see Anne, but quickly regained his professional demeanor. "Of course, Anne. We have an excellent oncology team here, but I must warn you, the costs could be significant." Anne nodded without hesitation. "I understand. Do whatever is necessary, and I hope we can keep this matter private, away from the media." "Dr." Cruz regarded her with a hint of admiration. "We always respect patient confidentiality, Anne. As for timing, Tom's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I recommend proceeding as soon as possible." Anne glanced at Mr. Johnson, and both nodded in agreement. "Let's do it," Anne said resolutely. "What do we need to prepare?" Now everything was clear. Important decisions lay ahead, but Anne knew she would not stop fighting for Tom, no matter the cost. As the doctor outlined pre-surgery procedures and consent forms to be signed, Anne Hathaway felt a surge of anxiety. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on her every step, yet her unwavering resolve pushed her forward. She knew this was Tom's one chance to fight the cruel disease. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the boy's hospital room. In Anne's hands were a pirate hat she had specially brought, and a shiny gold coin, along with the Pirates of the Caribbean DVD. Small but meaningful items she hoped would bring some joy to Tom, easing his overwhelming fear. As she entered the room, Tom's eyes lit up at the sight of her. Lying on the hospital bed, he looked small and frail in his patient gown, but his smile was as bright as a beacon in the darkness. "Captain Sparrow!" Tom exclaimed, his voice weak but filled with joy, a pure and heartfelt joy that made Anne smile. She gently sat on the chair beside Tom's bed, gazing into his innocent eyes. Clearing her throat, Anne suddenly switched to Jack Sparrow's voice, soft yet charismatic. "Ahoy, young pirate. I hear you're about to embark on a grand adventure." But Tom's smile faltered, and fear spread across his face as he remembered the doctor's words. They need to do surgery," Tom whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "I'm scared. I'm not brave like Captain Sparrow." Anne looked at him, her eyes softening, her voice firm yet warm. "Tom, listen to me. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared. And from what I've seen, you're one of the bravest pirates I've ever met." She reached out, taking his small hand in hers. "The doctors are here to help you, Tom. They'll fight the monster inside you, just like we fight sea creatures in our adventures. And when it's all over, you'll be ready for new adventures. So, what do you say? Ready to be brave?" Tom hesitated for a moment before nodding, a look of determination crossing his face. "I'll try, Captain Sparrow. I promise." Anne smiled, gently squeezing his hand. "That's my boy. Now, I've brought something special for you." She took the pirate hat and carefully placed it on Tom's head. It was slightly too big, sliding down to cover his eyes, but his giggles were the best reward. Anne pressed the gold coin into his palm. "This is for luck. Keep it close, and remember Captain Sparrow is always rooting for you." Tom's eyes widened as he turned the coin over in his hands, filled with wonder and joy. "It's beautiful," he whispered. At that moment, Mr. Johnson walked into the room, followed by a nurse pushing a small TV on a trolley. "Let's see what Anne has arranged for us, Tom," Mr. Johnson said with a gentle smile, his eyes radiating warmth as if to ease the tension in the room. Anne turned to Tom and gave him a sly wink. "Why don't we watch some real pirate adventures?" she asked, holding up a DVD in front of him. Tom's face lit up with excitement, but his smile gradually faded as he glanced at the IV drip in his hand. "But I'm not allowed to eat anything before the surgery," he said sadly. Anne didn't let the gloom settle in. She chuckled softly, her voice light yet brimming with energy. "Ah, but that's part of the adventure, isn't it? Even Captain Sparrow had his moments of hunger. It's all part of being a real pirate. So, what do you say? Let's be brave together, shall we?" Tom giggled and nodded. The fear that had been lingering seemed to retreat, replaced by the sweet joy and excitement of an impromptu movie night, enough to momentarily erase all his pain and worries. As the movie began, Anne Hathaway settled into a chair, relishing the rare moment of calm amidst the chaos of a stressful day. She glanced at Tom, who was quietly absorbed in the cinematic world, his eyes wide with wonder at the thrilling adventures playing out on the screen. From her seat, Anne felt a lightness in her heart, the warmth of the film's glow softening the cold sterility of the hospital room. Midway through, a sudden curiosity nudged Anne closer to Tom, a question rising unbidden in her mind. "Tom," she asked gently, her voice warm, "why do you go into those stores if you're not buying anything?" Tom's gaze slowly left the screen, his face turning serious, as if confronted with a question he had never truly pondered. I always dream about eating those snacks," he whispered, his eyes averting as if to hide a flicker of pain. We hardly ever get treats like that at the orphanage. Just standing there looking at all those colorful packages. It feels like maybe one day I could live a normal life like other kids. His voice trailed off, his eyes shimmering with simple dreams, a small smile touching his lips. And the air conditioning feels so nice. It's great to get out of the sun. My skin doesn't itch as much, at least until the owner gets mad and kicks me out. Anne listened to his soft, poignant words, her heart tightening. She marveled at the modesty of his dreams, and in that moment, she vowed silently to talk to Johnson about improving conditions at the orphanage. She would do whatever it took to make at least a part of Tom's dreams come true. As the movie went on, a nurse entered to prepare for the final steps before surgery, drawing blood samples and taking measurements. Anne felt a sense of relief as she noticed Tom barely reacting to the medical procedures, completely engrossed in the on-screen adventures. His occasional giggles and eager questions about the film transformed the hospital room into a world of adventure and magic, where pirates and Hollywood secrets mingled with hope and life. But as the movie neared its end, Anne saw Tom's eyelids grow heavy. He had fallen asleep, the Jack Sparrow pirate hat tilted on his head, and a gold coin clutched tightly in his hand, as if it were a promise of future adventures. Anne couldn't bring herself to wake him. She gently moved to the nearby couch and turned off the TV. Sitting in the dim hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors like a soothing lullaby, Anne reflected on everything that had happened that day. She thought about her work, meetings, and the career she had once pursued. Yet all of it seemed insignificant as she gazed at Tom's peaceful figure. Anne made a silent promise to herself. She would do whatever it took to help Tom overcome this battle. She would give him the chance to live, to pursue the dreams and adventures every child deserved. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the thin hospital curtains, Anne woke up from a brief uncomfortable nap on the couch. Blinking away the haze of yesterday's events, she noticed Tom was already awake. He held the pirate coin tightly, and when Anne's eyes met his, she heard a soft, gentle voice. "Good morning, Anne," Tom said, his smile trembling but filled with determination. Anne smiled back, stepping closer to his bed and gently straightening the pirate hat askew on his head. "Good morning, my brave little pirate," she replied, her voice warm and full of affection. "Ready for today's big adventure?" Just as Anne finished speaking, the hospital room door opened, and a team of doctors led by Dr. Cruz, a renowned oncologist with kind eyes and a reassuring demeanor, entered. The team began the final preparations for Tom's surgery. Dr. Cruz reviewed the vitals and the procedure one last time. At that moment, Johnson rushed in, slightly out of breath from a hurried morning trip to the hospital. He approached Tom's bedside, taking the boy's hand gently and saying, "Good morning, my warrior." His voice carried a blend of care and encouragement. "Dr. Cruz will take great care of you. Do you remember what we talked about?" he asked. Tom nodded, gripping the coin tightly in one hand and Johnson's hand in the other. His eyes locked onto the man and his voice grew steadier. "They'll make me sleep, then take away all the bad things in my body. I'll get better." Dr. Cruz smiled, nodding in approval. "That's right, Tom. And when you wake up, you'll feel so much better." But as the nurses prepared to take Tom to the operating room, Anne noticed the boy panicking. His eyes darted around the room and his breathing quickened. Without hesitation, Anne stepped forward, gently taking Tom's hand from Johnson's. Her voice was soft, a soothing reminder of the promise they had made. "Remember what we said about being brave?" Tom looked into her eyes, took a deep breath and whispered, "I'll try, Anne." He mustered a weak smile as the nurses began wheeling his bed out of the room. Anne Hathaway walked beside the stretcher, holding Jack Sparrow's pirate hat and the gold coin in her hands, offering gentle words of encouragement to Tom. In the cold, sterile hospital hallway, time seemed to slow. The echo of their footsteps reverberated against the white tiles. Anne's gaze never wavered from Tom, curled up under a thin blanket, his eyes still brimming with fear. "Tom, you can do this," Anne said warmly yet firmly, her eyes radiating confidence. She leaned closer as if speaking directly to Captain Jack Sparrow, the character Tom adored. "Captain Jack believes in you, and when you wake up, we'll have even greater adventures. I promise." Tom exhaled shakily, his small hands trembling, but he clutched the gold coin tightly. The anesthesia began to take effect, his eyes slowly closed, and he drifted into sleep. The medical team wheeled him into the operating room, the steel doors closing behind them with a final echoing thud. Anne and Johnson stood silently, watching the doors until they fully shut. Anne lingered for a moment, her eyes fixed on the closed doors. How many times had she witnessed scenes like this in her tumultuous life? But this time was different. It wasn't a role or a movie scene. This was reality, and it touched a tender part of her she hadn't known existed. She glanced at Johnson, their eyes meeting in a shared look of concern and hope. They said nothing, but the thick air of anticipation communicated everything. Johnson noticed Anne's phone buzzing in her pocket. Notifications from her agency, business partners, and various commitments, but she paid them no mind. "I'll do whatever it takes," Anne resolved silently. "For Tom, and for all the children. Everything else can wait." The two sat down in the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, silently praying for the boy. The ticking of the clock echoed like the beating of their anxious hearts, each second stretching into eternity. Suddenly, the operating room doors swung open. Dr. Cruz emerged, his face weary but marked with a reassuring smile. "The surgery was successful," he announced with relief. "We've removed the main tumor and the affected lymph nodes." A wave of relief washed over the room. Anne and Johnson embraced, tears streaming down their faces despite their efforts to remain composed. It felt as though all the tension and anxiety of the past weeks had finally melted away. Yet, Dr. Cruz reminded them, this is only the first step. Tom will need ongoing treatment to ensure all cancer cells are eliminated. Anne nodded, her gaze resolute. "Doctor, whatever Tom needs, we'll make it happen. Just tell us what to do next." After explaining the next steps, a nurse entered to inform them that Tom had been moved to recovery and would wake up soon. She led Anne and Johnson to the recovery area. As they entered, they saw Tom stirring slightly, his eyes fluttering open. At first, his gaze was unfocused, but then it landed on Anne. "Anne?" Tom murmured weakly, smiling faintly as he recognized her. Anne approached, gently adjusting the pirate hat on his head to avoid disturbing his fresh surgical wounds. "I'm here, Tom." "You did it." "You were so brave," she said softly, her voice full of admiration. Tom smiled again, his eyes closing as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. After Dr. Cruz departed, Anne pulled Johnson aside, her tone low and determined. "I want to start a foundation," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I was thinking about funding Tom's treatment, but I want to do more. I want to renovate and expand the orphanage, to create a larger, better space for these kids. And I think we should establish a clinic there so they can get the medical care they deserve." Johnson's eyes widened in surprise. "Anne, that's incredibly generous, but aren't the costs going to be astronomical?" "Probably," Anne admitted, her voice firm with resolve. "But I'll do whatever it takes to make it happen." As they discussed the foundation's details, a group of children approached, their faces filled with curiosity and concern. A nurse leading them reminded them to be quiet, but their excitement was palpable. The children gathered around Tom's bed, looking at him with worry and admiration. One boy noticed the pirate hat and asked, "Is he really friends with Captain Jack Sparrow?" Anne chuckled, crouching to the boy's level. "He absolutely is," she said, adopting Jack Sparrow's voice. "And I'll tell you this, He's the bravest pirate I've ever met." Laughter bubbled up among the children, filling the hospital room with an unexpected warmth. By the end of the day, Anne found herself reading pirate stories to the group, occasionally glancing at Tom, who was still weak, but smiling gently as his friends surrounded him. In that moment, Anne realized her life had changed forever. Challenges and obstacles lay ahead, but she was ready to face them. She vowed to do everything she could to give these children a chance to live, play, and grow with love, and to experience the adventures they deserved. If you found this story inspiring and full of hope, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you resonate with Anne and Tom's journey? Let us know your feelings, or share your own story if you faced a life challenge. And don't forget to click like if you enjoyed the story and share to spread this message to more people. Let's build a community of inspiration and compassion